Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, and welcome to St. Paul's Letters to America. My name is Gerard. I'm your host for this program. Let's start today with a prayer to the Holy Spirit. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, Creator blessed, and in our hearts take up thy rest. Come with thy grace and heavenly aid, and fill these hearts which thou hast made. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, so, welcome. By the way, I should mention that I'm a radio and television host for St. Joseph Radio and its affiliated network, SJEN TV, and I am appearing on WCAT courtesy of them. Now, this is the program that raises the question, what if St. Paul were alive today? What if he were here to write a letter to America? What would you say? This is the program where you will hear exactly what he would say. We know the answer to this question. He would say exactly what he wrote in his letters to the people in the Mediterranean world 2,000 years ago. His letters are as timely today as they were then because they, like all Scripture, express timeless truths. If not, then they will not stand up when we attempt to apply them to modern situations. Here, that is exactly what we do. Each week, we take an issue that is current in our lives and our society today and look at it through the prism of St. Paul's writings. Often we talk about two things people say never to talk about at the same time: religion and politics. We compare the wisdom of the day to the wisdom of a man named Paul from 2,000 years ago who knew nothing of our modern world and our modern problems to see if nonetheless his answers are what we in America need to hear today. St. Paul is sometimes seen as esoteric, speaking in deeply theological terms and hard to fully understand. But he talks from the heart, and it is his visions and insights into reality and our human condition, imbued with the love of God, that we seek to explore. That is why the motto we always seek to bear in mind is love and kindness through the light of truth. Hopefully that is what we do here. Now, last week we talked about a new abortion law that was passed in New York State. It legalized abortions right up to the last day of a mother's pregnancy, right up to perhaps a mother who's pregnant for 8 months and 29 days. But even more chilling than that, it's hard to imagine if something could be, but if anything is, it would be this. If a baby happens to survive that type of an abortion, if an abortion is attempted and botched, there is no medical care that is required under the law. There was such a requirement under New York law. That's now been removed because the baby is no longer, that kind of a baby, a late-term baby, is not considered a person. A baby who survives an abortion of this sort, since it would be well-developed, could be alive, struggling for its life. But the adults present with it could simply watch it die, heartless and cold. The interesting thing is this past week, a similar law was proposed in Virginia. And it also allowed late-term abortions. And similarly, there was a conversation with the governor of that state given in a radio interview. His name was Governor Ralph Northam. And he also talked about what would happen to a baby if it happened to survive or if it was alive after an abortion. And, of course, using the term aborting after a baby has been born is highly improper, but nonetheless, we'll go with that here. Now, this law, when it was proposed, was sponsored by a certain woman named Kathy Tran. She was a co-sponsor of the bill. And she was asked under questioning in the legislature about her bill and what it would allow. And one of the things that was asked is whether or not her bill would permit an abortion right up to the time a mother was giving birth. If, for example, a mother went into delivery, but before she actually gave birth to the baby, would an abortion still be allowed? She tried to deflect the question a little bit by saying that, well, it would be up to the mother and the doctor. They'd have to have a discussion. But the person asking the question insisted. He said, but all I'm asking you is, would your bill allow a mother who is starting delivery, who is already dilating, would it allow, even in that case, a woman to ask for and legally receive an abortion? Her answer was, yes, it would. Now, it's also notable that this proposed bill in Virginia would do something else. Virginia law has a prohibition against partial birth abortion. That is the procedure no one likes to talk about. That is the procedure that allows a baby to be partially born, half in and half out. If its head would then perhaps come out of the birth canal, then a doctor in this type of procedure could insert scissors into the baby's brain to cause it to die. That is prohibited under current Virginia law, as it is according to a law passed by Congress in 2003. Nonetheless, this bill that was just proposed in Virginia would eliminate that ban. Why? Why is that necessary? Well, in the end, this bill was not passed. But, as I said, the governor did, the day after Ms. Tran gave her answer in the legislature about what the bill would allow, the day after that, Governor Northam was doing an interview on radio, and the host of that program asked him, well, Delegate Tran gave the answer that she did about what the bill allows, and does he support that, and could he explain her answer? So he then proceeded to try to calm the waters over her admission that the bill would allow such an abortion. He claimed that concerns about all of this were blown way out of proportion. And he said that in a case such as that, where a woman was already in labor, he said, and I quote, "I can tell you exactly what would happen. The infant would be delivered. The infant would be kept comfortable. The infant would be resuscitated, if that's what the mother and the family desired. And then a discussion would ensue between the physicians and the mother." Governor also stated that legislators, most of whom are men, by the way, shouldn't be telling a woman what she should and should not be doing with her body. This was the governor's answer. This precipitated a furor all its own. People were aghast that he could calmly be talking about an abortion, again, an improper term, an abortion after a baby was already born. The baby would be delivered, he said. The baby would be kept comfortable. And then a discussion would ensue. Well, how are we to assess and how are we to respond to the governor of one of the 50 states in this country calmly talking about such a scenario? Well, for guidance, as always, we look to a letter from St. Paul. The letter today to which we refer is from his first letter to the Corinthians, specifically chapter 4. And in it, he says simply this: "I have applied these things to myself, so that none of you will be inflated with pride in favor of one person over against another. Who confers distinction upon you? What do you possess that you have not received? But if you have received it, why are you boasting as if you did not receive it? St. Paul talks about three things, essentially: pride, division, and boasting. Pride that elevates one person in favor of another, creating division, which then leaves people boasting over others and, in the end, over God. How is it that people unite? Instead of dividing, how do people unite? Through love. To love, we need to humble ourselves. That's always required. One always has to think of another person first in order to extend love. Love, as St. Paul says in another famous passage of his, is not concerned with one's own interests. One does not seek one's own interests when one loves. You're thinking about the other person. And when you extend love, somebody is usually grateful, receives it, gives it back. You have to think of the other person first. So to love, we need to put others first, like Christ did. In the ultimate example of love, he did nothing but act for the benefit of others. But pride gets in the way of this. It separates people. You think of yourself first and not the other person. This is what St. Paul is talking about, this basic this basic element of the human condition. So according to this, then pride and love are connected in an inverse relationship. But is this true? If St. Paul's writings are timeless, then they will stand up under analysis if they are true. Well, how can we tell if something is true? Well, one of the ways is to see if we can find support from another source that we find reliable or good. I would submit such a source, Blessed Mother Teresa, now Saint Teresa of Calcutta. And she put this into present-day perspective for us at the National Prayer Breakfast held in Washington, D.C. on February 5th, 1994. She said, "I feel the greatest destroyer of peace today is abortion, because it is war against the child. By abortion, the mother does not learn to love, but kills her own child to solve her problems. And by abortion, the father is told that he does not have to take any responsibility for the child that he has brought into this world. Any country that accepts abortion is not teaching people to love, but to use any violence to get what they want." That was Blessed Mother Teresa. She saw this as a simple equation of people using violence to get what they want, men and women using violence to get what they want, putting themselves first, not about love. So, one could ask, well, that's Mother Teresa's view. How about the other side of the equation? What can be said on the other side? We're interested in finding out whether what we're talking about is true. So what's the other view of this? There's an article that appeared in Nation magazine, which was entitled "Abortion and Love." It was written by columnist and author Katha Pollitt. And Ms. Pollitt writes, at bottom, abortion is about a woman's individual freedom, her right to love herself. Autonomy may be the prime quality, value, and reward in men, our archetypal heroes. Women are supposed to sacrifice for others, especially for children. Putting others first is what we tell women what love is. So here it is. She clearly says the issue here is the freedom over one's body that amounts to this, the love of self. As Blessed Mother Teresa said, love is about putting somebody else first, not loving yourself. And this is what St. Paul warned against. It's this very issue of self versus others, our perspective, our general outlook on life and our relations with other people that colors the modern secular world. If we turn away from God, we generally, in many cases, turn inward toward ourselves. There's no coincidence that a recent generation was called the me generation. For a subsequent generation, somebody coined the term me generation. We see this type of thing in the modern world in the emphasis on self-esteem over helping others. We see it in safe spaces on college campuses where somebody can be protected against somebody else saying something that he deems offensive. We see it in the fact that people no longer say, well, I disagree with what you say, but I respect your right to say it. That is just not acceptable these days. If somebody says something that is not agreeable to us, they are committing violence against us. They are invading our safe space. We have to be protected. We see this in the modern world and so many lessons in our modern secular world. But Ms. Pollitt perhaps is, well, not perhaps, but in my view is incorrect if she is read as saying that putting others first is what we tell only women, because it's not. It is what St. Paul tells all of us in multiple places throughout his letters. It is the very essence of the sacrifice of Christ. If men are not seen as listening to that advice and that example, and women are seen as listening to it to some greater degree, the answer is not to make women more like men. They're, in Ms. Pollitt's words, archetypal heroes. It is to tell men to be more like women. If women want to have pride, if they want to think of themselves as liberated, as equals, as whatever they aspire to be thought of as, why don't they think of themselves as perhaps better than men if they in fact love more than men do? Often, men do not acquit themselves very well in a case where abortion is considered. Often they push or threaten a woman into an abortion. Often they do everything but support the woman. One woman wrote about her experience with an abortion. She said that the media and school had been celebrating her right to choose, that it was not a baby, that a fetus was not a baby, but simply a lump of tissue. She said the media and school told her this. This highlights the fact that ideas really do matter. We are told in our modern culture that that feelings are more important than what we think. Not to use our mind, not to use our rational capabilities, but that we should make decisions based on emotions and feelings. And yet, all the while, we are being told that certain ideas are ones we should accept. Ideas, words, they have meaning, and they affected this woman. She accepted what the media and school had always told her. And in her early 20s, she was working as a reporter on a local municipal newspaper. She was in a relationship with a long-term boyfriend, and she got pregnant. They didn't want to, but it happened. Her father had been unfaithful to her mother and was an alcoholic. He was not going to be a source of support for her. There was no love coming from that direction. Her mother suffered from mental instability. Apparently she had some brain injuries at one time, but she suffered from mental issues. And sometimes she would even rant that she was miserable because she hadn't chosen to abort this woman and her siblings. Obviously, there was no support there, no love there. Her long-term boyfriend, contrary to her hopes that she would be happy about this, only became angry and upset at her. He admitted cheating on her, but he offered to commit to her if she had the abortion. I don't know what she was thinking, but of course, one of the things she could have been thinking is, well, if I couldn't trust him before, can I really trust that he would commit to me? In any event, there was no love coming from that direction either. Her employer was difficult. She expected her employer would be difficult about this. She says that she already had some friction in her community from some conservative elements, and that if she did not abort this baby and carried it, that it would obviously be known. It would become just visibly apparent that she was pregnant. People would know she wasn't married. She'd suffer a stigma. She thought that would just create difficulty for her in her career. Her friends all told her what she had been told in school and by the media, that it was her choice, and that it was a positive choice. It was a positive thing if she exercised this freedom. Her doctor would not do the abortion. He did not say why. He or she did not say why. But her doctor recommended that she go to a crisis pregnancy center for counseling. She thought crisis pregnancy centers were only for teenagers or rape victims, but not for somebody like her, an adult, educated, successful. When she went to the abortion clinic, she eventually went there. When she went, she still hesitated. She asked the attending person if she could only wait a few weeks. She said the person physically recoiled and complained that the longer you wait, complained and warned her that the longer you wait, the more difficult this is going to be. We're going to have to perhaps send you to another clinic. So, not feeling any love from a stranger, and sometimes people do receive love from strangers, but not in this case, she went ahead with the abortion. She said her feelings ran the gamut. She felt relief. She also felt sadness, despair, and numbness. All of them, the gamut. Her boyfriend let her go through this abortion alone. Again, no love. So she dumped him. She cut off that relationship. It did not, again, there was no lasting love in that situation. 4 years later, obviously, she had to go on with her life. 4 years later, she was then married, and she got pregnant. And this time, the person that she was with was very happy. They were both very happy. They were going to have a child. They were at the doctor's office. She was 10 weeks along, and the doctor asked her, "Do you want to hear the heartbeat today?" She said, "Okay." But inside, she said she was screaming and frozen. They went ahead with the procedure, and she heard it. Now, normally, when you hear a baby's heartbeat for the first time, your baby's heartbeat for the first time, a child living inside you, you hear that for the first time, it would be a moment of joy. And for so many married couples, pregnant couples, this is what happens. But not for her. She said she felt, quote, "no joy, only horror," close quote. She says that she then began a dark journey. No support from her husband either. Now, she wanted to go over the abortion that she had. She wanted some relief. She wanted some outlet for her grief, but he was not there to provide it. He simply said, as many of her friends did, she told a few friends about it, seeking their support, their response to help her. But everybody told her, just get over it. Each anniversary after this, the anniversary of the due date of her aborted child, she became depressed. She said there were times when she would be nursing her newborn son and she would just simply cry alone. Her pastor, when she consulted her pastor, the pastor, told this woman, again, she just needed to move on. This was a legitimate choice that she had made, and she just simply needed to move on. She then happened to see an ad in a newspaper. The ad in the newspaper said, "Do you regret your abortion?" This hit her like a thunderclap. She did not even know that it was okay to regret an abortion. She thought that only those with mental issues, she had been told, and Planned Parenthood says this, that basically only those with mental issues before an abortion have problems after. If you admitted to being depressed, to be overtaken with grief, remorse, sadness about your abortion, people would probably think, or that was her fear, that people would think that you had some type of mental issues. But this ad in the paper still stuck out for her. It had been placed there by the same crisis pregnancy center that she had opted not to go see earlier. She told her pastor that she was thinking about going there. Her pastor actually warned her not to go, but she went anyway. She began with this group a bit of a Bible study. And she said through the process, she learned to forgive others. She said she learned to forgive herself. She was the one, through the support now of others who, before she met them, were strangers to her, through the support of others, through their loving support, she learned to love. She was the first person then in her immediate family circle. She was the first person to initiate love in this whole scenario. And she learned, like I said, she also learned to forgive herself. Well, then what happened? She said she learned that God is not punishing and condemning. That was her fear. This had been weighing on her heart, and she said that weight was now lifted, although she still felt regret and grief, which is healthy. Also, something funny, her husband learned how to help her in this recovery process, to be with her in this recovery process. Before, he had just told her to get over it. Now, he was helping her get through this. Now he was learning to love. Love now begetting more love. She said she found out that it was okay to admit what she had done because God already knew. It was not a secret to him. It's almost funny to think that perhaps if we fail to admit it to ourselves, might be able to keep it hidden from God, perhaps. In any event, there's a particular passage from Romans. Interesting. St. Paul spoke to her with something he wrote in his letter to the Romans. He said, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. She knew she was a sinner. It struck her to her core that Christ could die for this sin. He knew about this sin. There was no secrets from him, and yet he died for her the same as he died for all of us, because his sacrifice, his existence, his being operates outside of the bounds of time. He sacrificed for her, even though she was a sinner, even though he knew what sin she was guilty of. This had an amazing impact for her. God was not a condemning, punishing God. God was love. She understood this and was able to extend love to others. So her story points up what we have been talking about, does it not? There is a pride versus love effect that we're talking about here. Pride does not make room for love. In the abortion situation, when everybody was telling her, it's your right, it's your right to choose, think of yourself. Everybody was telling her that. There was pridefulness there, but no love. Then, after she humbles herself, admits her sin, she learns love. And situations with everybody around her begin to improve. But what of Governor Northam? What if we go back to Governor Northam's comments? He says a discussion would ensue. In trying to calm the waters over this controversy about a late-term abortion, he says, well, if someone wants an abortion during a delivery, if they're changing their mind at the last minute, it's okay. There's no reason to make a slapdash decision right at that critical moment when there's so much stress. There will be time later to think and discuss it. And everybody just needs to cool down. Time later to think and discuss it. Time later to discuss. To discuss what? To discuss now whether the baby that has been delivered should continue to live? That's the only discussion that makes any sense here. Well, what does that look like? You've got 2 or 3 people, a woman, a mother and a doctor, or perhaps 2 doctors, sitting around deciding, well, we have this child over here. What are we going to do with it? The New York law that was recently made law, like I said, the Virginian law failed to pass. In New York, the law did pass. It declared that it was a fundamental right. The first thing that law stated was that it was a fundamental right of all women to decide whether to carry a child or to abort the child, and to abort the child even up to the last day of your pregnancy, which theoretically, as was borne out in the debate and question in Virginia, means right up to perhaps a woman giving birth. Fundamental right to decide about the life of others. That is what was discussed in New York and made into law. Because as I said before, the New York law also allowed a baby after it was born to die. This is the discussion that's going on in this country today. Whether children born can be allowed to continue to live. Up to now, the discussion has always been, well, this is a woman's right to choose what to do with her body. But now, if a baby is outside the body of the woman and has its own living, breathing body, how can that argument still apply? It can't. But people still have the same position on the mother's right to choose. Obviously, something is missing. But the governor, as he was going through this interview, spoke in a very calm, matter of fact manner. People just need to calm down. This is being blown out of proportion, he said. This is what would happen. There'd be a discussion. It'd be all very simple. It was almost as if, without even thinking, he wasn't even thinking about whether or not there was anything really wrong with this, whether or not there was anything really different about this now that the baby is outside the mother's womb. Why? Well, it's simply because the debate really hasn't changed. The debate was never really about whether the baby is inside or outside the mother's womb. The real issue is whether or not a mother and a father, if he's even in the picture, can decide they want to keep a baby or not. And that's what we want, and that's what our pride tells us that we're going to insist on. And we're not going to let anything get in the way of that. It is the epitome, it's the height, it's the peak of pride. We can dispose of, cruel word, but appropriate, we can dispose of other people who get in the way of our happiness. That's what we're talking about. Where, in the comments by the governor, as he's considering this, as he's saying what he said about this, where is the consideration for the other person? Where is the love for now another living person? Or is the thought completely, single-handedly all on one side of this equation? Why? Well, defenders of the governor might say that, perhaps he misspoke. His comments were made off the cuff. He didn't have enough time to think about it. He didn't really intend to say, what his words sounded like, and he could correct them later. But that's not what happened. The next day, I think it was the next day, maybe it was later, but anyways, following this, The governor said, no, I do not have any regrets. I don't have any regrets about my comments. His office actually issued a written statement of clarification. Now, a written statement like that is only done after people have had time to carefully think about it and after multiple people have had a chance to weigh in on it. So his office issued a written statement. That statement said that the governor was only talking about late-term abortions done in the case where there could be severe deformities or in which the fetus might be non-viable. And in his comments, the governor did refer to babies that had deformities or were non-viable. But what he actually said was that these late-term abortions they may involve a baby with deformities. They may involve a baby who's non-viable. He didn't say they were the only ones. And in fact, the law he was discussing has no such distinction. It doesn't say that these abortions allowed right up to the time of delivery, where then what are you going to do? So then you're going to need to deliver it and have the discussion afterwards. There's no qualification in the law that only is allowed when there are babies with deformities or that are judged by proper medical assessments to be non-viable. There's no distinction of any sort like that in the law. But even if we take the governor's office, even if we take the statement issued by that office at face value, and we accept it, and we agree that the governor was only talking about those types of abortions, we still have a problem. And the problem is this. This statement still admits the pride to decide who is worthy. Just as a conceptual matter, it still admits the pride that's required to decide that a baby with a deformity is not worthy of life. And number two, it also admits the remarkable pride that is necessary to decide a baby should no longer live who is already living outside of a mother's womb. The argument, as I say, had been that a baby inside a mother's womb fell under the mother's right to decide what to do with her body. Opponents had always argued that that was not the real issue. Opponents had always argued that there was no difference between a baby inside or outside. That if you took a baby, and especially in this case with regard to late-term abortions, you have a baby that is 8 and 2 weeks pregnant, 8 months, 2 weeks pregnant, 8 months, 3 weeks pregnant, that type of a baby is a person, that if it was outside a mother's womb, it would be capable of living completely on its own. It has to be a person. That was their argument. But abortion advocates have always said, no, the distinction isn't a significant one, that it's a mother's right to control her body. That's what's important. But now, if that no longer applies, are they acknowledging the argument of their opponents that there really has been no difference between a baby inside and outside, especially when a baby inside is 8 months long and completely capable of life on its own? No difference? Admitted, acknowledged. There seems to be, perhaps, in the fact that the governor could talk about this type of thing so matter-of-factly as if he didn't see that he was breaking into some dramatic new ground. If it never occurred to him, it never seemed to him that this was so different, it's probably because, as I said, in one regard, there really has been no distinction between a baby inside or outside, that in the minds of the people that have supported abortion, they didn't really think so either. But beyond that, we've just gotten so used to this idea of abortion. We've been living with Roe versus Wade now for over 40 years. Maybe this is just a natural progression of our thinking. People go down a slippery slope. Once you start downhill on something, you can easily go downhill further. The Planned Parenthood website, if you look at it, there's a document there called Considering Abortion, and it lists 9 items under the heading, Why do people decide to have an abortion? And among those 9 things, there are 3 that we're going to quote. One is They're not ready to be a parent yet. 2, it's not a good time in their life to have a baby. 3, they just don't want to be a parent. Question: do these now apply to post-birth abortions? How about that for a term? Post-birth abortions. Do these apply now? Is there really no difference inside or outside? There was a study that was done with people that had late-term abortions, that they found that people who had late-term abortions basically cited the same reasons as people for having an abortion as people who had first and second trimester abortions. There are now 9 states in the country that allow late-term abortions, by the way. So the question is, where do we go next? If there is a natural progression in our thinking toward what we're going to allow, where are we going to go next? Perhaps people who are in their old age should live or die. Perhaps some other group out of favor with society should be determined to die. Perhaps Jews, for example, we should decide that Jews should die. The Third Reich thought in such terms. The leaders of that notorious government were prosecuted for crimes against humanity. Well, besides pride, St. Paul also talks about a division and favoring certain people over other people. Well, who's being favored? Who's being favored in this situation nowadays? Who's being favored in our society's acceptance of abortion? Well, it was recently found out that the National Institutes of Health have a contract with the University of California, San Francisco, which, quote, requires UCSF to obtain body parts from unborn babies to make at least 2 types of humanoid mice. I kid you not. This contract, besides venturing into territory that we would have thought is one we could not go, mixing humans with mice for research purposes, also has a secondary problem of creating and maintaining a demand in the market for aborted body parts. Who's being favored? The unborn babies or mice? Also, if you want something else that you might find interesting, something else you might never expect to find, in New Jersey. New Jersey is one of the states that does allow late-term abortions. In New Jersey, there's a new law that's been proposed which would make it illegal to kill pregnant livestock. Apparently, this proposed law came about after some pregnant cow jumped off a trailer headed for a slaughterhouse. Pregnant cow jumped off a trailer. My goodness, the only cows that should go to a slaughterhouse are cows that are not pregnant. We have to protect these animals. The irony, I'm not even going to comment. Now, there is a woman, however, who had a different view on this whole situation, and her name was Sarah. And Sarah gave birth to, she carried a baby to term. Who people had told her to abort. She had found out early on at one point that the baby was not going to live, that the baby could not breathe. It had some significant disability, and it would not live. And she was told to abort it. She decided to carry it to term. She said what surprised her was that she was met with anger from coworkers and colleagues and others. How could you do this? How could you, what if this baby survives? What if it lives? How could you bring suffering into the world? She was surprised The people were actually angry with her. But she did. She did carry this baby. She carried it to term. And actually, the baby died shortly before it was going to be born. Naturally. Just naturally, passed. And she said she learned to love this life that was within her. By loving her, she learned something very important. And she learned freedom. She learned that there's also a freedom that we have to love. Instead of a freedom to think of ourselves, we have the ability, the freedom to choose to love, to choose to give of ourselves. It is, of course, a transcendent freedom, is it not? It is, of course, the very type of freedom that the Catholic Church cherishes. That it is said that that we have freedom, we have free will, but it is not a free will, as St. Paul also says. There is not a free will to do what we want, but it's the freedom to follow God's way. That if we exercise our freedom, we have a freedom, we can choose to follow God or not, but if we do, then we transcend our human slavery to sin or selfishness or things of that nature. And she found that. She found that by carrying this baby to term. But again, we're talking about abortion in general. What about the kind of division, the kind of favoring of one person over another that would occur in the case of somebody who has a late-term abortion, a very late-term abortion? Well, we can only imagine in that case, but by the way, we're not talking about the song by Mercy B, but we can only imagine what that would be like. What would the division between a mother and child then be like? We have a mother who we just talked about, named Sarah, who gave birth to a child she knew was not going to live. And she felt love. She felt freedom. What about a mother who aborts a very late-term baby? A woman that we talked about in her 20s who had an abortion and then found healing through a crisis pregnancy center. She felt inner turmoil. She felt a total lack of peace. What would the division be like between? And that baby was only 10 weeks or so. Well, I think the baby she aborted was 12 weeks. What would the division be like if you carried a baby that was more than 8 months pregnant? What would the inner turmoil be like then? What about the division in the abortionist? Would he or she be able to live peacefully? Would anger perhaps just naturally come out against other people? Would if he or she felt something somewhere in their subconscious or their was wrong with this, that maybe that wouldn't cause them to lash out in other ways? We talked about loving begetting more loving, and a lack of love begetting, more lack of love. Would that occur for the people performing these types of abortions? What about the division that would occur with people surrounding these people? What kind of turmoil would it cause within families? Well, we can only imagine. But, as I say, St. Paul also talked about boasting. Boasting. Does boasting enter into this question? Well, it certainly does. They celebrated the passage of the law in New York State. They cheered on the Senate floor. They ordered buildings and landmarks lit in pink light to celebrate it. But St. Paul asks us a nagging question. He inconveniently asks us, what do you possess that you have not received? But if you have received it, why are you boasting as if you did not receive it? Did each of us receive the gift of life? Then why are we boasting as if we had not? As if we earned it, as if we're entitled to it? Because if we are, if we earned it and are entitled to it, then we could act as if it was something that we could give away or deny. But if we were given the gift of life, how can we do that? Put another way, were we given a gift by our parents when they decided not to abort us? Were we given the gift of life from God? Crudely, if someone pays for a drink or a meal at a restaurant, the next time, is it not our turn? Or do we simply take the gift and never repay the favor? What would we think of such a person? Now we're talking about the gift of life. So whether you believe in the gift of life as something we receive from God or simply from your parents, the nagging question from St. Paul is just as relevant. Why are we boasting as if we did not receive life? Now there's a woman, her name is Jessica DeBalzo, and she wrote an article entitled, "I Love Abortion," implying otherwise accomplishes nothing for women's rights. She writes, "A great many women like abortion itself. They like knowing that an unwanted pregnancy does not have to yield an unwanted child. They like knowing that their mental and physical health take precedence over an embryo." She says, "Women who value their freedom should be proud to say that they like abortion. In fact, they should venerate it wholeheartedly. Abortion is our last refuge, the one final definitive instrument that secures our bodily autonomy. What's not to love? Love and veneration." Proud to say it, she says. Likes knowing that they have precedence. What have we been talking about? We've been talking about the pride to favor ourselves over others. She says exactly that. This is a veneration of the triumph of self. The bishop of the Diocese of Arlington, Virginia, who would have been affected by this law, his name is Michael Burbidge. Bishop Burbidge says that, he has a little bit of a different view about the governor's comments and this whole subject. He says that the governor's original interview comments contained a staggering admission, one that we've been talking about all this time, this ability to decide to take a life. The bishop writes, "This attitude and the bill that was defeated last week reflects a new level of deep-rooted animus against the inherent goodness of every child, and that they demonstrate how far abortion advocates are willing to go in taking the life of a precious child." Bishop Burbidge writes of the inherent goodness of each precious child. Boasting presumes that we have some value, some goodness, some rights over and above those of another. Ms. DeBalzo specifically says this. Well, how do we think of ourselves? How do we think of our family members, our friends? Are they precious? Are they good? Do they deserve life? This is the inherent log in our eye as we attempt to say that others are less valuable than we are, that others, that just lately born, can be allowed to die. In Virginia, after the governor made these comments, there was a huge furor that erupted, not over these comments, but over the fact that some 35 years before, in a medical yearbook, there was a picture of him dressed in blackface standing next to somebody dressed in the costume of a Ku Klux Klansman. That generated tremendous media coverage. However, the comments that the governor made on abortion, acknowledging this staggering admission that the bishop talks about, received no coverage on ABC on Wednesday or the Wednesday that the comments were made, or on the following day, that Thursday. The same was true for NBC and MSNBC. CBS didn't the first day, they covered it the second day in a piece that was criticized for downplaying the comments or trying to defend them. CNN gave it a total of 3 minutes. There was no public shock. There was almost the same kind of calm and disinterest that the governor himself expressed. As the governor said, so I think this is really blown out of proportion. But again, we want the government not to be involved in these types of decisions. We want the decision to be made by the mothers and their providers. And this is why legislators, most of whom are men, shouldn't be telling a woman what to do with her body. It's always good to get a second opinion, or at least two providers to be involved in that decision, because those decisions shouldn't be taken lightly. It all sounds so reasonable, does it not? It all sounds like something we can discuss so calmly, does it not? And yet, what are we talking about? Only when we remind ourselves of what exactly it is we are talking about, the decision of 2 or 3 people to take away the life of a now living, breathing person, do the words of St. Paul come back to us. Who confers distinction upon you? What do you possess that you have not received? But if you have received it, why are you boasting as if you did not receive it? Here we took a simple message from St. Paul about pride, about the division between people that it causes, about the boastfulness that results from it. And we applied it to one of the most serious issues of our day, and we found what? We found it applies. We found that it explains what's going on here. What other explanation can you have for people who maintain an argument based solely on a distinction of a baby being outside or inside a woman's womb, which allows people to say, well, this decision is all about a woman's right to do what she wants with her body. And then after that no longer applies, that rationale, that argument, that thinking no longer applies, they still maintain the right to take a life. Is that not pride? Is that not, I just want the result I want? And it doesn't matter what these nice legal distinctions happen to be. It's the fact that I want it. And this is true for women and men. Men are probably worse. They don't even in many cases, they may not go through anywhere near the mental gyrations that a woman would about whether to do it or not to do it. They just simply tell the woman, go ahead, do it, do it, do it. But anyways, we found this simple writing of St. Paul applies, and it explains this. Why? Because it contains truths. Truths that we can lose sight of when we turn our eyes away from God. But truths that become apparent when we turn them back. And one way we can turn them back is to read the writings of St. Paul. Next week, we'll be here with another reading from St. Paul, looking at some other issue for us in America today. We hope you will join us. We thank you for listening. God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.